Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1322. Aleph Shin Chav Beis. We concluded in last class the paragraph on this page, on page 1322. And briefly, just to sum up, talking about the two types of sweetening severities, what he calls hamtokas agvuras. We began on top of page 1316. He said, "You do as she is, beze fanim b'hamtokas agvuras." That there are two manners, two ways. The severities of Gevurah, which we've already learned, include harsh severities, include concealment. The animal soul are sweetened through Chesed or in Chesed. Both ways are coming through Chesed. One, that the sweetness essentially gets mixed in like sweet waters into bitter waters. And through work and effort, it controls and overrides and outnumbers and neutralizes and nullifies the Gevurah. But it's not, doesn't make it disappear completely. Even if it's completely not active, it could always come back. Whereas the second ephon is a higher level of chesed that's so powerful that it basically like zaps out the whole Gevurah altogether and it transforms it. And he gave examples for that, what we learned in the previous paragraph, the example of seeing the king's face, the glowing, kind, loving face of the king, what he called chesed of atik, or chesed d'kshet, that causes the prosecutor to automatically memela. This is a work mamayla mata, memela, that automatically transforms the Gevurah. He gave the example of the level of one second, I'm just looking what other example. Oh, then the sweetening of the water through the Eitz HaChaim, the tree of life. The tree of life is a entity that fundamentally Chaim be'etzem and Chesed be'etzem. So when you put the water of the tree of life into the Eitz HaChaim, into the water, it transformed it completely. That something that was fundamentally bitter became now fundamentally sweet. And then finally, Torah. Torah is Eitz Chaim hi lemachzikim ba, and Mamoyer sheba machzir lemutav. That in addition to Torah repelling any form of impurity or toxins, does not makabel tumah. And the Talmud Chacham, the fire of Gehenna does not affect him. It actually transforms, machzir lemutav. It transforms the negative into positive. And he explained the word Hamoyer, and Torah, there's the Moyer, the source of Torah, which is the Pnimius, even in Nigla the Pnimius, and that has that power. And why does it say Lemutav? Because Lemutav is higher than Toiv. It doesn't just return the person to good, but returns them to this Moker HaToiv, like he said. Toiv be'etzem, Moker l'chom minei Toiv. And all this is due to this higher Eir that was Nizgala. And Navayda, this is the Avayda of Tzadikim Gemurim, through their Ava b'Tainugim, their love of delights, out of pleasure, Tainugim, that comes from Yechidah Shebenefesh, that has the power to completely transform the natural midas of the animal soul. Like he explains in chapter 9 in Tanya, and then in chapter 10, that's the transformation of the bitter to the sweet and the darkness to light. That's where we stopped, the end of that paragraph. So essentially, we have two methods here. Both are through Chesed. One is Chesed engaging with Gevurah, getting energy from Chesed of Arich Ampin, I should have added. V'rav Chesed. But it's still, from a place, Arich is still a Sherish, the root of Netzalim, of the emanation, so it's still commensurate. And therefore doesn't have the power to transform, as he explained at the bottom of 1320. It only has the power to subdue and even influence and even impact the animal soul. like we see by Tzadik Shein Gomer. More than just a Beinoni, like he explained at the bottom of page 1320 on top of 1330. So it has impact. But to say that he transformed it completely, Moyas Bara, that he completely despises it and transformed it to good, that you can't say. That's only the higher level. The second form of sweetening, the Gevurah, which transforms it. So in a way, you could say one is iskafia and one is ishapche. One is subduing. Iskafia means it subdues, it nullifies, it controls, even if it completely controls. And we learned that it's also complete. It's not just necessarily two against one. It could even be that the Nefesh Habamis agrees. Or in the case of the prosecutor, that the judge that came with the guilty verdict agrees to the ones that said innocent. But that doesn't mean there's no din at all. There was din, except it was overridden and then also agreed, like we learned. But it's still not transformed fundamentally. And then comes Isapcha, which is a transformation. Now, in the next paragraph, he's actually going to explain the difference between the two, because I know it's been confusing, I see from some of the questions. Because this second one, even though it's transformation, it's not a transformation from within Gevurah, it's a transformation from without, from the Chesed that's more powerful than it all. And he's going to explain that now. And that's going to be for a few more pages. And then on 1325, he's going to talk about a third Eifen. I just wanted to point out to you, actually the Rebbe, remember this part of Ayin Beis, as most of Ayin Beis, was not known to us until 1977. At the end of 1976, Yutas Kislev, Tavshin Lamed Zayin, the Rebbe said we're going to publish the whole Ayin Beis. So till then, Ayin Beis, we only had the first, I think it's till Vayigash Ayin Gimel. That would be the first, let me just tell you the exact amount. The first 31 Maimorim. Basically, the first 245 pages. That we always had. But the rest was unknown. The Rebbe had it. And actually, matter of fact, he said many discourses based on Maimorim that we did not have. Once in a while, he may have gave out once a Maimer from later on. But after 1976, 1977, actually, when it was printed, then we have now access to Ayin Beis. This piece that we're learning now, the Rebbe actually cites in a letter that he wrote in 1950 to Rabbi Nissen Emenov. And it's in the Igris Kodesh, in the Rebbe's letters, volume 3. And it's also printed in Likutei Sichos, volume 6. I just wanted to read the Rebbe's summarizing what it says here in this Maimer. And I think when you see it, you see right away the very starkly defined the two types of sweetening. So I just wanted to read that inside. If you would give me a second, let me just pull up the letter. So, if you want, in volume 3 in Igris Kodesh, I'm not sure what page it's on, but in Likutei Sichos Chelik Vav, it's on page 393, and the Rebbe says, that he brings the three efanim b'amtokes hagvuras. The first one is skafia. As I just said, skafia means it subdues, it controls, it subjugates. Hamtokosam alidei ribuy achsodim. So sweetening them through ribuy achsodim, you bring enough chesed, it overrides the gevurah. And he says in Avodah Keshenefesh Alikis Minatzeches as Nefesh Habamis b'mulchama. When the divine soul wins over the animal soul b'milchama with a war, it's engaging, it's a war, a battle. That's the first way. V'hamayla b'zeh, what's the mila in this? We're going to learn this now in the next paragraph. This is from the bottom up. B'nefesh habamis mitzad atzmai. And the animal soul on its own, gam came to say that as v'nesalis. The nefesh habamis on its own is also stimulated, awakened, and is elevated. That's number one. Number two, the second eifin of hamtaka is sapcha, transformation. Like in these bitter waters, through throwing in, inserting into the bitter waters, the eitz, the tree, the wood, from the tree of life. This is all summary of Ayin Beis. L'sham, shu etzem chesed ba'tev. Now we're talking about the fundamental chesed and tev. It's coming from a very high level of chesed and tev, from eitz achayim. Hamayim atzmim nasum v'sukim. The bitter waters themselves become sweet, but how is it? Not through bechama. Al de ribu er nefesh alikis b'meila nizdacha gam nefesh habamis. Through an abundance of so much divine and so much light and energy of the divine soul, so b'meila automatically it also refines the animal soul. This is mamayla lamata, from the top down. If that's the case, it could be also only be temporary. And then he goes to the third, which I'm not going to read right now, because that's going to come later on page 1325 and on. But we'll get back to it when we read, when we learn it. I'll come back to this letter. Now he also brings here the Neisa oven and Kavish oven. It's a whole piece of nigla here as well, this letter, also based on the Ayin Beis, but I don't want to go into that right now. So I wanted to make this just the way the Rebbe sums it up. And now we're going to learn the next paragraph is going to actually be an explanation of the difference between these two ways, but they're both coming from Chesed. So he's going to explain like this.
Could you say it again? This is in Likutei Sichas Vav?
Yeah, I closed it already. So it's, yeah, I gave the page. Just go back in the recording of the page. Yeah. And it's also in Igris Kedesh, volume 3. The Kol Zeh, we're learning inside the new paragraph on page 1322. The Kol Zeh, hu sham tokas ha-Gevurah, hu-Gevurah hu aidei ha-Chesed. All this, meaning both manners, both ways of sweetening, is that the sweetening of the severities of the judgments of Gevurah is through Chesed. And the transformation of darkness is through Eir. Not through that the Cheshach itself or the Gevurah itself is being transformed through itself. It's some other force. Chesed is transforming it. The Gam Hamtoka HaBeis, because also the second manner, the second type of sweetening, Shagvura Mishapach Be'etzem Mahusa, that the Gevurah, the severity, gets transformed in its fundamental nature. Not that sweetness overrides it or neutralizes it, but it fundamentally has been changed due to the fact that it came from such a high power of Chesed. And the darkness itself was transformed to light, mamish. Had it called Zeh, even that level, it didn't happen on its own. It happened because Chesed and Eir came into the picture, like he made it very clear on page 1319. He said clearly, Chesed mamtikas Gevurah, like a hefchi atzur gamayim. That you need something. What's causing the bitter to become sweet? What's causing the water to give the stone to give water? Or what's causing the klola to become a bracha? Vayapach Hashem Elikim. So this is all coming from a force that's not in Gevurah. It's a force outside of Gevurah. It's coming from Chesed and Eir. And now he's going to say even furthermore that Adarabah, on the contrary, the second form of sweetening needs even more Chesed and Eir than the first type. I'm going to explain. But Adarabah, Ayin Beis, in the second form of sweetening, let me correct I'll rephrase what I just said. In the second one, the primary power is coming from the Chesed and the Oir. See here clearly he's equating Chesed and Oir and Gevurah and Choshech. Very clear here. So he says, in the second form, the primary force is Chesed and Oir, is the Chesed, the kindness, the love, and Oir, the light. Shari be'efen am toka aleph, because in the first manner of sweetening, where you're bringing in Chesed and it's engaging with the Gevurah. However, it's outnumbering it, it's overriding it, it's neutralizing, it's nullifying it. There, the Chesed manifests internally, slapshus, and it gets mixed into the Gevurah. Example would be, you have judges sitting in a bezdin, and they're arguing the case. And this one says innocent, Chesed, and this one says guilty, Gevurah. So this is an engagement, this is a discussion, this is even a debate. Or it's the Bezdin Shalmaila on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Adin, Day of Judgment. And we're standing in judgment before the Bezdin Shalmaila. And the prosecutor comes and gives a case and says they sinned. They deserve a certain type of judgment. The defense gives defense. And they're discussing and arguing. Until there's the Ba'er Pnei Melachayim and Tkiyah Shefer, that resolves the issue. But up till that point, Chesed and Gevurah could be engaging with each other. And even if Chesed wins, it didn't come just like that. It came through a discussion, so to speak. Or the same thing with the Nefesh Elikis, Nefesh Abamis. They engage with each other. The Nefesh Elikis says, do what Hashem wants. The Nefesh Abamis wants to do what its own selfish interests. And there's a battle. Like he explains in Tanya, there's a battle. And even when the Nefesh Elikis wins, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It was through engagement. So he says Islapshus Yisarvus essentially is engagement. Yisarvus is like the Yisarvus of the bitter water. Sweet water is being mixed into the bitter water. And when there's enough of it, it will prevail. So he says, he's explaining now. So in this form of Amtaka, the first manner, how does the idea Saskus? That's with an engagement, with an involvement. He's like really applying himself with Gevurah. Like the Nefesh Elikis has to work with the Nefesh Abamis. It's not just coming from above and saying, hey, I'm more powerful and I just completely transform you. Hisaskos means that you're engaging with it, you're involved in it. It's like it's a tirche. It's a work. Uba Aveda, what is that in Aveda? Remember the Ava al Pitam V'das Avas Elam means that a person who has a Yetzer Hara, Nefesh Abamis, and the Aveda is that Nefesh Abamis is creating a state of darkness. We learned earlier, it conceals on the animals, the divine soul, and it conceals on the godliness. Going back all the way to the beginning of the topic where he spoke about the purpose of creation. Page 1307. He said clearly, the Cheshach of Elam HaTachten, now comes Aveda, it's a real Aveda. Just look at yourself. It doesn't come automatic. Every morning and every moment, we have to constantly struggle with our animal soul. The animal soul has its own interests and its temptations and is seduced and its whims and all its impulses. So there's an Aveda, you have to bitter HaCheshach, of refining or clarifying or separating the darkness. That comes Aveda Shal Pitam V'das. How do we do it? Through work. That what? We contemplate. 1 second here. Why am I following my animal soul when God created us? And there's a God in everything. So this is a contemplation that makes sense, that God provides, gives me life, gives me health, sustenance. So therefore I should make a bracha on the food. Or I should be careful how I behave. The Nefesh Abamis wants you just to follow its own whims, its own impulses. This is classic, basic Tanya, but it's also the basic life that we live. And there's a battle. And you need a Yisaskus, which means you need to engage with this dark force within us, this voice called the animal soul. And it's avodah shal pitam b'das. We're not invoking right now a higher power. You're simply trying to persuade and convince based on seichel. Like you said, the basic first level is avos elam, to develop after Hashem Elokecha, a love for God that's based on logic, based on a reasonable explanation, a rational contemplation that in turn will impact the emotions, that we should be drawn to godliness instead of to materialism. So it's essentially this contemplation that spirituality is superior to materialism. This is where the Rebbe took the word. This is melmata l'mayla. You're working from the bottom up. You're not invoking some higher power. You're working with the nefesh habamis, with the Gevurah. It's in a form of involvement, engagement. It's askus means working with it. Just like when you educate a child. You can't just do it from an ivory tower. You have to be involved. You have to teach the child good manners. You say thank you. You say hello. You say you're welcome. This is all hisaskus. This is not automatic development. This is work. So what means cheshech here? That means working with the animal soul, lifel by habitl, to cause, to affect it, the bitl, that it should have this sublimation, that it should have this humility, that it should be subjugated and not just follow its own egocentric interests. This is the hisaskus in the first eifon of amtaka, the first way of sweetening something. In this process, the ultimate goal is, and that's what you want to achieve, that there should be a status of the nefesh habamis. The nefesh habamis shouldn't just be ignored; it should be awakened and stimulated and aroused. Shegam hu mis'eder ba'ava. That also the animal soul should be stimulated and awakened with love to God, based on its terms. You explained it based on its terms, that it's good for it. Hu chayecha. God is your life. He's also giving you life, and it's good for you to connect to godliness. The ima yes, and even though shezeu b'derech melchama, even though this is in the form of a battle, shanefesh habam is leichem neged hanefesh alekis, where the animal soul is fighting against the divine soul. L'kol mokim. Nevertheless, ultimately what happens is, the manner through which the animal soul finally begins to give in and begins to surrender, is through this process. Shagam hu mevinas ha'inyan ha'eliki. So even though initially he's your enemy and he's fighting you, but ultimately this manner of surrendering is that he too understands. It's not through overpowering him, period, where you just bring in so much that you completely, like I said, completely neutralize him. It's in a way that he also understands the inyan eliki, the divine concept. V'gam hu maskim, and the animal soul also agrees ala bittel, the nefesh elikis. He agrees on the bittel that the nefesh elikis, so-called, is proposing and presenting, or he agrees to the bittel of the nefesh elikis. At shegam hu meseder ba'ava, to the point that also the animal soul gets inspired and awakened by Ava. So initially it kicks and screams, like would be in any given situation, like an animal, but ultimately you can tame it to some extent, and that's the work of the Mulchama between animal soul, divine soul and animal soul. The Ima Yes, and even though and even though what's happening here is, like we learned earlier, this is not transforming the animal soul. When he finally agrees and surrenders, it's only on the Chetzenis and his pashtus, his extension, it's his expression, the thought, speech, and action of the animal soul, or even more than that. But as the outer dimension, the animal soul has not fundamentally been changed. Like he says in Tanya, by the Beinani, for sure not. It says there that it's just like a sleep. You have it under control, but it didn't fundamentally change. And it's only in a form of iskafia, which means subduing, controlling. But kol mokim, nevertheless, the manner of this subjugation or this surrender and the repair of the animal soul. Nevertheless, even though it's not a complete transformation and it's only iskafia, the animal soul is participating in it. And it's happening through its Chassidus. It's also been stimulated. Like we spoke the example in battle, that you vanquish the enemy, and then the enemy is convinced, you know what, my interest right now is to cooperate with the one who was earlier my enemy. Doesn't mean you became really a friend. It's my interest right now to cooperate for my own survival, for my own family, or whatever it may be. So to say that it's completely affected from above, no, the animal soul is also participating. It's just not a full transformation, obviously. That's why it's not called a sapcha. So, but on the other hand, it does have its own participation. It's not completely the power of the chesed. That's what he wants to say here. That in the second eifin, you need the ikar is chesed. In the first eifin, the Gevurah is also participating. Mashenken ba'amtoka Ayin, and here's the contrast that he began with. But the second manner of sweetening, there it's happening completely differently. There it's the gili of the oir that's so powerful that automatically it nullifies, like I said, zaps out the animal soul. That's where the Rebbe took those words. And this is the form of birur, of clarifying or separating or refining, that comes from the top down. Next page, 1323. This only has the power that comes from a very powerful higher light and energy, the Shem Ma Hamavarer. This is not coming from Shem Ban, the behemoth. This is coming from Shem Ma Hamavarer. He used the word Shem Ma and Ban before earlier. He's just bringing it back, but it's the same idea as Chesed. This is coming from Shem Ma, the one that's doing the refining. Okay, so what did he establish? That here, therefore, the ikar is chesed. In the first eifin, it's also chesed that is ultimately the animal soul is being subdued and trained by the divine soul, but there is some participation from Gevurah in the process. And in the second eifin, Gevurah has nothing to do with it. It's completely the chesed elyon, the higher chesed, the eir elyon, that achieves it. It's the wood from the Eitz HaChaim that made the water sweet. It's not that the sweet water, so speak, was diluted the bitter water and ultimately turned it into some form of sweetness, not transformed it, but overrode it. But there it's engaging with it. Here, we're talking about putting another entity, a higher force came in and sweetened the whole thing, like he said, and that transforms, but it's not with the participation so much of the Gevurah. That's what he's saying right now. I'm going to read on, but I want to stop in case anybody has any questions.
Yes, I do. The Rebbe, when he said that it's not necessarily permanent in the second eifin. Can you explain that a little, please?
We're going to continue learning here. You'll see it all in this paragraph. The Rebbe didn't say a chiddush. The Rebbe is just summing up what it says here. I just read it because it was short and sweet, but we're going to learn it now inside. Remember, the Rebbe is summing up what we're learning now. I just read the Rebbe before we read it inside here, so you'll see shortly. Okay? Any other questions? Okay.
The one was when it said I think the opener Aleph that the Nefesh Elokis, the or the Chesed is involved, become hisaskus with the Nefesh Bahamas, and it convinces it it's good for it himself to go along with the Nefesh Elokis, mitam vadas. But the Rebbe also uses the word that there's a transformation there that he's doing it out of Ava. The Shavazeh Yesh Isoras mihanefesh Bahamas shagam hu misora be'ava. Isn't that so? That's not just Tam Vadas. It's coming on from its.
Why not? Ava shall be Tam Vadas. It's like if the Nefesh Habamis feels that it's in its interest to love God, it's a av al pitam v'das that the nefesh habamis relates to. This is av shal pitam v'das, not just tam v'das. It's like understanding that I'm getting my life sustenance from something. You'll have a certain love for it. That doesn't change the nefesh habamis fundamentally, but it does effectively right now cause the nefesh habamis to also have a certain measure of love.
So he's not just agreeing with the nefesh halakis. He's also he's from himself, from within. It's come to accept not only he's stronger than me and he's right, but I've come to on my own conclusion, so to speak.
It doesn't mean it remains. But for that, it was done through the nefesh halakis. It didn't happen on its own. Nefesh habamis didn't just wake up one morning. The nefesh halakis fought with it. They fought together, and ultimately the nefesh halakis convinced it, so to speak. Like I gave the example in the battle. You can fight an enemy, you win the war, the enemy is still your enemy, but then maybe you show the enemy through incentives or whatever it may be, that's in your interest to not just cooperate, but also to have a measure of lava here.
Okay, so that was what I was confused, because in the first example, I thought he was cooperating because he was subdued. But now he's doing it. Not only he was subdued.
We learned this before. He said it because I just told you it's in his interest. If nefesh habamis, he explained. If you wish, go back a few places. He explained at length or how you explain the. You're asking me how do you explain to nefesh habamis how to love God? You show how it has self-interest. Its interest is served that way. If the nefesh habamis self-interest is served by loving God, that it's going to cooperate.
Right, I can understand that.
A lot of people learn Chassidus because their nefesh habamis happens to like it.
Right, I can understand that. I was just going back to the comparison and the mashal of the battle between the two kings and the enemy. And then
the enemy, you convince the enemy it's in its interest to serve the king, the enemy king who was enemy, and not only do so, but do so with the element of affection even.
The affection. Because a lot of times an enemy.
You're asking the question on the mashal or on the nimshal? Which one? I mean, we can't dissect it scientifically. The logic is very clear here. The animal soul in its self-interest could love God if it can be convinced, and that's a step in the way. Right,
and then there's another level where it's just behaving itself, but it doesn't agree with it or everything. But it's not
talking. This is not an analysis of. All Tanya is the place where he talks about the different levels. Here, he wants to explain two levels of sweetening the Gevurah. One is Mamata Lamaila, where the Chesed gets involved and engaged, like in educating. Like I gave the example of it. It's just you have to bring practical examples. The only way you can understand. Educating, training, and you could even train someone that was initially a wild kid, for example. You could train them to become nice and kind. Different ways, and even they're wild. And then there's another, is a overpowering chesed that he's saying here, has the power to transform, but it's not with engaging with the animal soul. That's the contrast here. This is not a thorough discussion on every manner of how the nefesh halakis and nefesh habamis work with each other. That I would suggest going back to Tanya, because in Tanya, in chapter 9 especially, and the chapters afterwards, he discusses. That's why I always say Ayin Beis is focusing here on the transformation of darkness to light, Gevurah to Chesed, and the different stages of how that takes place. But obviously, it's not going to cover every angle. Okay. I was just reading, someone was writing their story about their own journey. And ultimately, talking about a very liberal woman who was anti-religious in every way. but she considers herself like a transcendent person, a hippie type. And ultimately, she came to see that Yiddishkeit, especially through Chassidus, satisfies transcendence and is driven by transcendence. Her rejection of religion was more because of its didactic and dogmatic, like closed-minded attitude. When she saw that it's like the music of it, so to speak, that is even the Nefesh Abamis that was always driven by that like transcendence, ultimately realized that you can find that in Yiddishkeit. So that wasn't purely a completely like, no, like, okay, I surrender, God is right, and that's that. It's a surrender that also there's a lot of cooperation from the animal soul because it feels it's getting filled up. Another approach would be that someone comes and meets the Rebbe or has some epiphany and it just overwhelms them, and they may not even fully appreciate it, but definitely not internalize it. We're going to learn there's a mile in each one, but that would be like an example of the two approaches. One that someone learns to appreciate it, and the other one that something very powerful happens, which, as we'll soon discuss, each one has something the other one doesn't have, which of course is very much part of our different types of avodah. Actually, in Tanya, he doesn't really discuss these two. He's comparing in Tanya to Tzadik Gomer, but the Tanya doesn't really talk about these two ways of getting the animal soul involved. Here he does, because that's what he wants to discuss here. So let's read on, and we'll see more about this, okay? So he says, שזה רק מבחינת עליון דשם מה המבארר. Yeah. Just give me a second. I wanted to just see something. Yeah. The Shem Ma Ban, he brought on page 1318. Shem Ma Lamal M'Shem Ban. Okay. So as we learned there, Shem Ma and Shem Ban, Ma is Gematria Odom, which connected more to Nefesh HaLekiz, the divine soul. Ban is Gematria Behema, which is connected more to the animal soul. So when you say Shem Ma is Mavar Shem Ban, is basically Chesed is being Mavar Gevurah. And the second Eifen, that's the Birr. It's coming from the Oyer Elyon, the Shem Ma is being Mavar. The Birr de Bederech Mamata Lamaila. Because the Birr, the first manner, the first type of refinement, which is from the bottom up, where you're engaging with the animal soul, Hurak Maha'oras Shema, Shebeshem Haban. There, it's also coming, remember, Chesed is still the force that ultimately refines the animal soul, the Chesed of the divine soul. Oyer is still a force. However, there's the reflection of Shema within Shem Ban, Va'birru birru de Ban. But the birr is the birr of the animal soul, because you're dealing with animal soul also being engaged in it. Va'birru de Mamayla Lamata, and the refinement that comes from the top down, Hu birru de Ma. That birr is the birr of Ma. In other words, it's the power of Ma that's doing the birr. Va'ayim mashin is Baradil Vayidaber Pinchas Habeis. And the Maimer Pinchas Habeis, in volume 2, he discussed that, if I recall, I think he's discussed it there in the context of the man, if I remember correctly. Lechem min hashamayim, amayla lamato, mamata lamayla. One is bitter metech eichel, pselis metech eichel, where you remove the waste from the food or the food from the waste. That's the bitter of ban. Obviously, you always need ma to do is always the mavarer, but that's more engaging. And then there was mamayl lamato, like Shabbos, eichel metoich eichel. So you're not talking about engaging, you're talking about a higher level of gilui, and there's no the birur is either food from food or it's even higher than birurim. If I recall correctly, that's what he spoke about there. The ima yes, and even though shabir hu ba'ifenayli yeser, and even though this second way of sweetening, that this is a higher eifin of birur, because it's literally transforming it. Shenasa teiv mamish, because here it's making it completely good. It's changed bitter to good, dark to light. V'lo b'derech milchama, and not through a battle. How does it? How does it? This came b'derech mamela through the oir. It did not come through the animal soul. He's saying this both as a positive, but also as a negative, as we'll learn shortly. So just bear with this, because he's going to be going a little more in depth into this level of this higher level of sweetening and speak about its quality, but then it's also going to go back and say, nevertheless, it has something that is lacking, that the first birur has something over the second type. So just, you'll see how it goes. It's going back, it's twisting back and forth there. So meanwhile, he's still talking about that it's b'derech memela, and he's going to say now, in this second eifin itself, there's also a manner that's also hisaskus, but not full hisaskus. In this second type of sweetening, there's also more, within that itself, there's a category that there is some engagement. And same as with Teira Shabal Peh. Remember, we learned earlier, Primis HaTeira, Chitzenius HaTeira, and explained that Primis HaTeira is called Eitz HaChaim. Why? Because it's not involved in arguments of right and wrong. It's not involved in the matters and affairs of this world. Primis HaTeira talks about God and godliness. Nigla the Teira is called Eitz Hadas Tevera. And the Alter Rebbe asked the question, how could you say that? So he explains from the Raya Mehemna, it's called Eitz that it's engaged with Tevera. Not that, God forbid, it's Tevera. It's Teira. But it talks about Tahir, Tameh, pure, impure, kosher, posel. It's kosher, it's not kosher. Guilty, not guilty. Taina shel sheker. Reuven says this, Shimon says that. You're dealing with the affairs of this world, which is choshech. So Teira Shabal Peh is engaging with the world, and yet it's Teira. So which one is it? Is it the first eifin or the second? So he says it's in the second eifin Amtoka, which we know is Teira. You also have a level where it engages. There's also Isaskus, like the Isaskus, Bein Yonim Hagashmim, that Teira Shabal Peh gets involved. When you're learning the Gemara will talk about back and forth. So who's right, Reuven or Shimon? Is it kosher or is it not kosher? So it's involved in physical affairs, ubetainas the emes v'sheker, and in arguments that are right, true, and false. A person says, you owe me $1,000. The other person says, no, I owe you $500. Somebody is not telling the truth. So this is so he's saying in the second eifin, you also have something that's b'derech hisaskus. It's not quite like the hisaskus with the animal soul, as we're going to learn, like in the first way, but in Teira itself, in the second way, where you're bringing a higher force into it, which is Teira, but this Teira can be involved in Isaskus. And yet the birur in Teira, even Teira Shabal Peh of Nigla, is also b'derech mamela, Because it's not like the Torah is getting involved with a person who's lying. The Torah is clarifying and telling us, okay, if a person says, I owe you 500, the other one says, you owe me 1,000, if you acknowledge half, you acknowledge that part of the person's demand, so you have to take an oath. So the Torah is not getting involved in trying to heal this guy that's lying. Torah is giving us a clarity that Eibishter says, this is the din. This is the din of what you do in this case. So it's coming b'derech mamela, but there's this askas because it is engaging at least in the arguments of right and wrong and true and false. So he's going to soon come back and compare it back to the first Ephraim. But first he's going this way. Yeah. And I was giving another example for this type of birur that comes automatically. Kamoi hamasoyis. An example for this would be like the masoyis, the journeys that the Jews took in the wilderness. So they took 42 journeys. Shaholchu b'midbar. They traveled through the wilderness, through the desert, Midbar Sinai, the Sinai desert. And the Aron that led their way, the ark of the covenant, the Aron carried them. What did the Aron do? The Aron Hayrig killed the Nechoshim, the serpents, Ba'akravim and the scorpions. And it basically straightened the way before them. It cleaned the way. It was like paved the way before them. Like it says in the Pasha, that the Aron Bris, the Ark of the Covenant of God, went before them and it paved the way. It opened the way because you go through a wilderness. There are all kinds of dangers lurking, and the Aron cleaned the way. What kind of bitter was that? This was the bitter that happened through their journey and their travel through the wilderness. So they did deal. They had to deal with a midbar amim that had scorpions, nochash sort of akriv, but it was not through a war. They didn't have to go and kill them personally. They didn't have to go hold battle with these dangerous reptiles or animals. Rakshan is battle haram emel. The negative, the evil, these destructive forces automatically were eliminated. Ve'ikre, he adds now, hu b'chinas tchiyas hara.
So, Rabbi, I apologize for interrupting. This is Ofen Aleph or Ofen Beis?
1 minute, let me finish and everything will be explained. Don't worry about it. I'll explain it all. And this primarily is a form of tchiyas hara. Why? Because at the end of the day, the nechoshim v'akravim were not transformed. They were just eliminated. They were like killed. So he says that's tchiyas hara. He's qualifying this because he's showing that in the Masoyis is not exactly what we learned before about the second way, which was transforming Gevurah to Chesed. So he's qualifying and saying that this was primarily tchiyas hara. However, why is it example? Why is it a good example? Because it's giving us a b'derech memela approach, which is the second manner, where the Chesed is just powerful enough that automatically dispels. Again, the first way is engaging. Here, it's not engaging fully. It's b'derech memela, not through milchama. Even when there is engaging, like with Torah Sheba'al Peh, and now we're traveling through the wilderness, they weren't traveling on clouds. They were engaging with these things, but they were eliminated b'derech memela through Torah. So we're talking about the second way right now. The whole thing is the second way. Now he goes back and says, okay, now that I've explained that in the second manner itself, there's also there's also elements where there's engagement. But he says, but the ikar of Shema, which is the second manner, the primary of the second manner, even though there is a subset within it that does engage, its primary method is not through engagement at all. So he's going back to the second way after doing this qualification, and he's going to come back and explain that even though it's a higher form of birur, it's going to have something that the first eifin, which is through engagement and through battle, and it sweetens the Gevurah through persuading it, etc. It doesn't. He's going to get back to that. So here he's talking now. The ikir is, so basically he's established two ways. One is through milchama iskafia. It subdues, but the animal soul is engaged, and it itself gets persuaded. It itself is part of the process. In the second manner, it's a sapcha. It transforms, but the animal soul is not engaged in it and not involved. And in that second eifin, there's also, which is called the birur of Shem Ma. The first one's birur of Shem Ban. But in the second way, there is also a way that there's a subset of engagement, but it's still b'derech mamela. So now he says, but the ikir is there's no engagement at all, and he's going to give an example where there was no engagement at all. Ukamoi, Bizman Beis Hamikdash, in the time of the Holy Temple. Shayabir b'derech mamela yedei shema d'atzilus. Then the birur, the refinement of the world and its negative forces, did not happen through engagement, but it happened mamela automatically through shema v'atzilus, through a higher light, a higher energy that just automatically did the refinement. Like he says in Likutei Torah, in the explanation of the Maimer called Bamidbar Sinai Ba'oil Moed. It's actually this week's Parsha, this Shabbos. And he adds, and the birur then was mamish like isapcha, like he's saying here in the second manner. Like we find by King Solomon, Shlomo didn't go to war. David went out to war. Shlomo, everybody, because of his great wisdom and great light, everybody was subjugated, and sublimated. Nichnoya means when someone not surrenders. Nichnoya means they acknowledge him or they defer to him. They were all deferential and nullified and subjugated a love. Like we see Malchus Shva from Ethiopia, she came with gifts. So Chassidus brings this as an example of two things: the birur not b'derech milchama, no war. It's mamela, like mamayel lamata. And secondly, it creates a sapcha that people just acknowledge him and accept him not because he won over any war. It's due to the great light that he emanated. V'im kain. So based on all this, in this second form of sweetening, it's going back to the original point, that adarabah. Here, the primary force is oir. In the first eifin, the driving force is oir because it causes chesed, causes the sweetening. But the Gevurah is part of the process. Here, the primary force is oir. And that was the darkness is transformed and tainted the light. It's not because the cheshach acknowledges the oir. The cheshach was bypassed, was completely not even recognized. It's that the oir came into the mokam cheshach with such power and intensity that the cheshach became like oir mamish. It wasn't due to the cheshach in any way being engaged or involved in the process. But this is not a case where the cheshach on its own became light. It all came from a higher force of oir. Now he's going to give in the parentheses a taste of something we learned very much at length in volume 2, but Kamosh is bad, and we're going to get back to it in the third eifin. He says the ozu b'chinas era cheshach, because when cheshach itself becomes light on its own, then you don't call it that that transformed the darkness. You call it Eir HaCheshech. You call the light of the darkness. Like it says in the pasuk by Kriyasam, the Onan v'Acheshech, that there was a cloud and darkness, and that itself illuminated. As we shall explain, that will be the third level. We're not up to that yet. But he's again just referring to it for the thoroughness of it. So there will be a level where the darkness itself. Now we're talking the Eir is so powerful, it just transforms the darkness. Through the Eir, it caused that the Cheshech should become Eir. And just to explain a little more, he adds in the parentheses, this is a level of Eir. This is not a level of Cheshech. This is the Eir from the level of Eir. The Cheshech has become mamish like Eir, but it's not the Eir of the Cheshech itself. It's not the energy of darkness, it's the energy of light. However, the energy of light was so strong that it made the darkness as equal to the light. And there's another thing called Eir HaCheshech. The Cheshech itself, like we learned earlier, has its own power. Who created darkness? God created darkness. That darkness has not been transformed. That darkness has just been bypassed. What's happened is that the Cheshech has become like light. But it's the power of light here, the Gili of Eir, not the Gili of that's within the power of Cheshech. So in other words, it's not the Helam Ha'atzmi that we're going to learn about. It's not the power of God's power to conceal, it's God's power to reveal, but the revealing is so strong, it can override the darkness and completely creates pure light. And also the dark has become light. But it's not the darkness on its own that has become light, as he's going to continue to explain. And it's certainly true that the fact that the darkness has now become light, that too is a major achievement. So if, let's say, the sun, the daylight is so powerful that it shines all night and there's no darkness, the sun never sets, like it was in the beginning of creation, that too is a big achievement. That which would have been dark is now turned to light. He says that's also greater than light on its own. But still, it's all about the power of light. What you're getting is a demonstration of God's infinite power of light, not the power of darkness itself to become light. So even though he's calling it Ishapcha, he's calling it Ishapcha Mamayla Lamata. So you need to really think about this, because usually we think of Iskafia Ishapcha as two approaches. Either it's Iskafia and you're not transforming the thing itself, you're just subduing it. Ishapcha means you transform it itself. He's explaining now there's two forms of Ishapcha. The second one we'll learn later. There's one Ishapcha that can come, that the power of light is so strong, it transforms the darkness, but the darkness has never really been transformed fundamentally from within. It's just the power of God is so strong that it completely changes everything around it. And that's ultimately not the ultimate Ishapcha that we're going to learn about. That's what he's saying here. So it's greater than light itself, because now it shows that the light can even impact the darkness, but it's not transformed the darkness. Now you're supposed to start getting a sense of what he meant when he spoke about the two opinions about darkness. Is it absence of light, or is it an entity of its own? Here, clearly, as an entity of its own, you could take control of it and turn it into light, but it's not that the darkness, that entity itself is not changed. So that's in Ishapcha itself, a different, a Mamayla Lamata, and then we'll learn about a Mamata Lamayla in Ishapcha. So interesting, the first oifen of sweetening is Mamata Lamayla, so it engages, so in some way it impacts the animal soul more than the second way, but not in quality. What I mean by that, it didn't transform it. In the second way, it gets transformed, but it's not from within the Nefesh Habamis. And the third way will have both qualities. It will be from within the Nefesh Habamis, and it'll be totally transformed. He's going to say this, basically. So essentially, the first sweetening is not transformative, but it affects the Nefesh Habamis is involved in it. So it's personalized. In the second way, there's no personalization. It just does it memela. It just completely transforms the animal soul, but the animal soul is not engaged in the process. It's just that the oil of godliness of Nefesh Elokis is so powerful, like Tzadi Gomer. It's not a Baal Tshuva. At Tzadi Gomer, his Nefesh Elokis and his love for God is so deep that it literally floods the second left hand. This is what it says in chapter 9 of Tanya. It like, think of it like it floods from the right side of the heart. The blood flows into the left side of the heart to the animal soul with animal, and it completely floods it and transforms it. But not because the animal soul was engaged. It's all mamela. It's like Torah, like we're learning here. So it's greater than libechol bekirbi, where it doesn't affect that side, and it's only light. Here, the light has transformed the darkness. So it's called Mekol Mokim Harikol Zeh. It's all shows. No, it's dira b'tachtenim. That godliness can be a dira in this close of worlds doesn't just mean that God's light is more powerful than tachtenim. We ultimately want the tachtenim themselves to receive God. Not just that even in the darkest place, godliness can come and completely transform everything. It needs to come also from the bottom up. The only difference is that now we're talking not just light on its own, but the darkness has also become light. That's because the light came into the place of darkness. And it's a very high level of light, exalted state, to the point that it could transform cheshech to er. That also darkness cannot darken before you. Nothing stands in your way, God. The pasuk says that also darkness does not darken before you. Darkness would blind or darken anyone else, but not God. Nothing can block God's light, basically. And that's why, with the power of this greater light, this powerful light, and the inner dimension of the infinite divine light, remember, in Aveda, this is the love of pleasures of the Tzadi Gomer. Or al Yedei Torah, the B'chinas Gili HaMoyer Shabbat. Or through Torah. Well, he doesn't say or. And through Torah. Through the revelation of the Moyer. Remember, that was the second way. Moyer, Shmachzire Lemutav. Last is Gam HaCheshecher. To also cause that the darkness should be light. And I was going to give a dogma for this. Anybody want to ask anything? Now, remember when we were learning, I said that a lot of ideas are going to come clearer as we learn on. Rabbi Rashab is developing this. He didn't say everything earlier. He was first putting things into place. Now, as things have developed, you could see the picture emerging far more comprehensively than we initially thought.
This inyan of this Yisapcha from the higher or Naila, the Yoser, and in a functional matter, it's through Ava, the Tanugim. So is that something that a non-tzaddik can accomplish? In other words, is that like B'chol Me'adacha? You're always saying you have to relate to this in your own, at your own level, in your own way. Is that fair to say?
Everything can be related on your level in your own way. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I mean, the choshek being good in itself, it seems like it's like a very godlike property. It's like an amazing thing. Like we said before, like Gevurah could be good, and it stays Gevurah, but it shows a divine purpose and that we have to get to understand and utilize.
Well, look, it's I already discussed it earlier when we spoke about it back in Helam Atzmi. And we're going to talk about this at length later. But if you just want a little taste of an application of this, it would be like the difference between two levels of tshuva, about tshuva. One where a person hits rock bottom and they come to realize that they need a lot of light. So what happens is their deep thirst causes them to reconnect or connect to godliness. And that's why it's so powerful, because it's coming from a dark place. However, the actual sins or transgressions or the things they learned not necessarily has been transformed. You could have that even a person who's in that darkest place has now seen the light and is connected to godliness. Then there's a whole other thing, that the very darkness itself and the suffering that a person went through, or the Gevurahs that a person went through, that itself teaches them something that they could only have learned by being in that dark place. So Chesed can lead to a very powerful level of Oyer, or in this case, the powerful level of Oyer can be so deep that it could permeate. It would be just like a person who's wandered very far away, and God in his grace says, okay, let me extend my hand, and something happens in your life. You meet somebody, for example, the unexpected, you didn't do anything and you're avoided for that. It's like God saved your life, basically. Miracle. Like in this case, an alien came and just pulled you out of the darkest place. There are people who talk about that they were in a place that they never thought they could escape, and then something happened. It wasn't because they came to understand or they learned something. And that is like, God taking you out of that situation. So the Oyer of God is so strong, it could even come in the darkest places. But then there's another thing where either the darkness itself teaches you something that only there you could have learned about a certain level of God you never would have learned about, or even when you are lifted up by God, still the experiences you had inform your future, and you become a person, for example, that can help other people in that dark place. Now, we're going to learn more about that in the third level. I don't want to go too much into detail because I want to learn it when the Rebbe Rashab says it. But I have said this already in earlier classes. The only thing is, there's so much material here, it gets overwhelming. And that's why sometimes you have to go over it again and again and again. In truth, this goes back pages upon pages. When he started talking about Ein Oid in the beginning of this volume, where he's already began discussing this topic. And as I said, I've read these pages probably 100 times for sure, maybe even more. You have to keep reading it and reading it to really appreciate, because it's a very expansive puzzle, and pieces keep coming here and there. Then suddenly you get it, and then a whole new idea comes up, and it's all coming together in a way. Still far from over. As I said, there's at least 20, 30 pages more in this whole discussion. So we'll go over it many, many times. So the key thing is to remember that these are all stages in this type of training. I mean, you could find also examples in educating our children this way. You can educate your child by training them and saying, say thank you, say please, and things like that. That's engaging with the child, explaining to them al pitam v'das. And there are times you just have to tell your child, this is how it is, and that's it. You don't cross the street alone. And you make it very, very strong, and they hear an authority. It could be fair, maybe, or whatever it is, but it's not always that you've educated them. You just lay down the letter of the law. Now, obviously, engaging is always better because the child understands on his own, but sometimes it doesn't work because the child's not ready to understand. Sometimes you need to just hear it the way it is. Like I said the other day about Aseh Lecha Rav, Uknei Lecha Chaver. If the Rav becomes just your friend, then you may be missing the authority that you need. Sometimes you just need to know this is how it is. There's no ifs or buts. But at the same time, the more we understand it, the more we can internalize it and integrate it, obviously is more pnimiusdik. So you really want both. But the fact is, when it's more pnimius, it's going to be a lower level of oyer. If it's going to be a higher level of oyer, it's going to be less pnimius. And the third way is going to bring together both. The highest level of oyer plus a transformation from within. That's the thing here that we need to understand. In other words, each of these two that we're learning so far are critical. And he's now going to give an example. I wanted to just go through the dogma from Matan Torah. Coming to Matan Torah, very fitting. So he's giving an example now where Oyer is so powerful that it transforms darkness. I already gave examples with the Masoyas and so on, but he's going to give this ultimate example. So unless there are more questions, I was going to read on here. Anyone want to ask anything else? An example for this, for what? That the oil is so powerful that it also changes the darkness to light, but it's still light. It's the power of light, not the power of darkness. He says like this, like he says before, it's not the oil acheshach, it's the oil of oil that reaches even in cheshach. He says, Dugma, who kamoi by matan teira, by the revelation that's signed, the giving of teira. The ksiv vayered Hashem al har Sinai, that God came down, descended on Mount Sinai. Sheyigili erein sof mamish lemata. What does that mean? That there was, God obviously didn't physically make a move from one place to another. God is everywhere. But spiritually speaking, what happened was, conceptually speaking, that God's presence came mamish lemata. That means vayered Hashem al har Sinai. He came down mamish, the revelation of the infinite divine light, mamish al ulafisha, and temporarily, hoyamata kamoi hamayla mamish. The world below, the earth below, was temporarily mamish like lamaila, meaning mamish like you saw ruchnius in gashmis. U'k'moshe kosav, like it says, v'hasinai oshan, the mountain itself, oshan was clouded or smoke. Oshan kule was completely covered in smoke or cloud. Shezeu shenichlal b'madregas hakdusha mamish. What is that pasuk saying to us? It wasn't just a visual light show. It was because the whole mountain became consumed with godliness. The madregas hakdusha mamish. It was completely absorbed, encompassed, absorbed into and dissolved into mamish kedusha. Shezeh iyina oshan. That's the symbolism of a cloud. It's very ethereal. You know, you put your hand through a cloud, it's there, but it's very, very subtle. Like it says elsewhere. For who and why and what caused this to be? Why did suddenly the mountain become this way? It's a physical mountain. A moment before, the mountain was a regular mountain. When Matan Torah ended, the mountain remained a mountain. And to the extent we know that it wasn't even transformed because it doesn't retain any of the holiness. But at the time, the mountain itself was smoking, was cloudy. That was because the God came down in a fire there, and it caused all that smoke, all that, to the point, v'chol hanegei bahar, it says there that anyone would touch the mountain was considered, if you do not touch the mountain, you would die. Why? Because the mountain was transformed into a basically godliness. Shanasa Kodesh. It became holy. It became sacred. And furthermore, he continues, Ukamoy came by Matan Torah, and so too by Matan Torah, Nasu Dvorim Agashmim, the physical affairs, the physical matters of this world, became b'madregas ha'kedusha b'amitzvah shenitnu b'gashmis dafka. It transformed the physical objects of this world. They became in the level of holiness, sanctity, in the mitzvahs that were given dafka b'gashmis. As we know, before Matan Torah, the mitzvahs were all beruchnis. They only had a spiritual impact, besides bris, besides a bris milah, that Hashem told them, b'psarchem, do it in your flesh. But all other mitzvahs had only spiritual impact. They didn't physically. They were not of physical objects of this world, and they didn't change the physical objects of this world. Because till Matan Torah, the service of God, the service was beruchni, spiritually. The kaimo was called Torah. The patriarchs, the aves, our forefathers, they fulfilled the entire Torah. But it was v'hakol beruchnis, everything on a spiritual level. And the physical matters of this world stayed in a state of cheshach. So was here, the was in avodah, ruchnis, but the physical world was not changed as a result. And Moshe Rabbeinu, he drew down the below, by him receiving the Torah. It says, Vayered Hashem al har Sinai, well, Moshe Amar Alei, Alahar. Moshe went up. Moshe channeled that which God brought down into the mountain, that transformed the mountain. And Moshe, bringing down Torah and mitzvahs below, he brought it down that the cheshech itself, which is the physical, the cheshech, the darkness of this physical world itself, became oir. What does that mean? What does that mean? Specific example. V'hu the tefillin, the parchment of tefillin, v'tzemerat tzitzis, and the wool of tzitzis, the esrig agashmi, and the physical citron, the physical esrig that we use on sukkahs, ukahai gavna, and etc. And similarly, it means with all mitzvahs. Nasa b'chinas mamish. So it wasn't just shibud halev ha'meir that we bound our minds and our hearts to God. The physical parchment became holy. It became mamish, and rotzna elyon mamish. The rotzna elyon of God, the will of God, permeated and physically transformed the physical object, that from now on, that cloth that you use for tefillin, you no longer can throw it out. You no longer can treat it in any way. It's not neutral. It became kedusha. This, he says, is an example. That means that the Eir came into the place of cheshech of Olam Hazeh, and turned that cheshech of this world into light. But it didn't say, but this did not happen from the cheshech. The world itself did not transform itself. This was a higher power that came down and it's so powerful that it could transform even the physical into Eir. The chenu b'karbonis, he says, similarly is also by offerings. Shemagdish behema. What's an offering? You take an animal, not just a meditation, not just words, thoughts, feelings, intellect. You're taking a physical animal, shemagdish behema, and sanctify it. You're saying this animal is designated to be a carbon to the Hashem. And once you do that, you can never reverse it. You can't come and say, hey, you magdish it. She'emer harizeh eila, he says this is going to be an eila, a carbon eila. It's a particular carbon that you bring, an offering. Harizeh carbon shenasa behema kodesh. This becomes a carbon, an offering, that the behemoth becomes sacred. Up till then, the behemoth was just a neutral, mundane animal. And the meat afterwards, after the carbon is offered, he basar kodesh. It's holy flesh. It's holy meat, I should say. Which means you can't just use it for anything. The yesa dugma lezeh, and an even better example, or even closer example to this would be, hu achilas hakoyanim, is the kohanim who eat this carbon, the kohanim eichlim and bailim mischapim, that the kohanim eat from the meat of the carbon, and the bailim and the owners of the carbon that brought it, they get forgiven. Why is it a greater example or closer example? He says, because shezeh achilas adam shem ma. Adam is gematria ma. That means the kohanim here are the Adam of Shem Ma, Shalamaylam Achilas HaMizbeach, which is higher than the Mizbeach consuming the animal. Bechina Shem Ban, the Eish Tamid Tukad, so that animal being consumed by the altar, by the fire, the burning fire on the altar, is the bitter of Shem Man. The kohanim eating it is the bitter that comes from Shem Ma. Shubchinas bitl the Shem Ban levad, b'chinas bitl hayesh. What the Mizbeach consumes the animal, it's only the bitl of Shem Ban, it's only bitl hayesh. V'achilas Adam hu shenichel mamish b'chinas Shem Ma datzilis. Whereas achilas Adam, that would be like the first way of sweetening, where it's Shem Ban, so it engages more with the animal, but it's a lower level of birur, only bitl hayesh. You're only being mevatel, so-called expression of the animal soul. And achilas Adam, it's mamish nichel and shema. It's completely oir. And he says, v'cheinu ba'achilas ha-tzadikim. And the same is true when tzadikim eat a meal. Ubesud is the Shabbos. And the meals of Shabbos. The tzadik eichel is seva nafshe. A tzaddik does not eat because he's hungry. He eats to satisfy the hunger of his soul. The kol zeh, and the same thing is Suda Shabbos. You're not just eating, it's a mitzvah of Einik Shabbos. The food itself, like he says in Tanya, chapter 7, the food itself becomes mitzvahs Einik Shabbos. The kol zeh hu shaydeh nasa cheshach b'chinas mamish. All this, however, is that the that through the cheshach itself becomes mamish. But it's not the transformation from within. That's what he says here. Okay, we'll stop here by this end of this paragraph. There's going to be one more paragraph where he's going to explain this a little deeper. And then on page 1325, in 2 pages, he's going to go to the third and highest form of sweetening of the Gevurah from within. Not from the Oyer, but the Cheshach itself, like we're setting the stage here. But this has been now, this is the explanation here.
So this is very, very illuminating, pardon the pun. I'm just wondering how we went from the beginning of this class and from the past several days, talking about Chasadim, loving kindness, etc., to a discussion, sweetening the Gvuros, to a discussion about light essentially illuminating or transforming darkness. I mean, I get, can you explain that correlation?
I've explained it already in all the previous classes. Chesed and Gevurah is like Oyer and Cheshach. Gevurah, I said at the beginning of this class, Gevurah includes severity, judgment, simtsum, din, concealment. This is a given. So that's essentially the correlation.
Well, just metaphors. It's just basically
It's not metaphors.
to the other.
It's not metaphors. It's the level. Gevurah means all of that. Gevurah is Gevurah and din. Simtsum, Shem Elikim. These are all synonymous.
I know it's all relative, but they're also midos. I mean, Chesed is a midah and Gevurah is a midah.
We're not talking about midah. So what's your point? So it's a midah, right? Okay.
So
what's the contradiction?
Are you saying there's more light? They're saying there's more light in Chesed than Gevurah. That's just an axiom, I guess.
I wouldn't say there's more light than Chesed and Gevurah. Chesed and Hamshachas Oyer are the same idea. Gevurah and Simtsum and concealment are the same idea. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could say that Simtsum is also a form of light. It's God's power to conceal. Mm-hmm. I don't know what you mean by light. If you're talking about light as in a flow of Gilui, Oyer and Gilui, it's like it's in the pasuk. It says, "Vayikra Elokim la'Oyer Yom u'lecheshach kara Laila." Means so basically, Chesed and Gevurah are 2 attributes, but they're also 2 tracks. One is the track of Gili, one is the track of concealment. And that's why they serve as Chesed and Gevurah as well. So
I see. So
I mean, it's
Chesed is flowing and it's revelation, and Gevurah is constrained or restraint and concealment.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
So sometimes when you talk in the midas, you could talk Chesed and Gevurah as kindness and discipline. That's true. But here he's talking the broadest sense of it. The Chesed and Gevurah in this case is, he says,
revelation and concealment. Yeah.
But it's also here also kindness and judgment. Judgment being, in general, when a person is in a state of judgment, they're in a state of, they're not going to show you their love. They're showing you more their discretion. They're more in a state of calculating and evaluating, as opposed to Chesed, which is in a state of kindness and compassion.
So I guess the reason I was working this backwards, so inductive, right, is because he gave these examples of these practical and material world types of examples of sweetening, if you will, or the capacity of the ore to illuminate darkness with these various mitzvahs. He gave, for example, the tefillin and the esrog, etc., and the wall of the tzitzit, etc., etc. So it's beautiful, of course. I mean, it's incontradictable in essence what he's saying, but nevertheless, it's hard to liken the I don't know, the sanctification of what. Hold on, it's not hard to liken sanctification of a material thing to kindness. You see my question?
Yeah, because but that comes from learning Chassidus. You come to the question is not a question once you learn Chassidus, because this is not a mechanical and technical discussion here. It's all conceptual ideas here. So if you read, for example, on page 1307, where he talks at length about why the neshama comes down here to radiate the world, he makes it clear. Or when he said on page that the whole yesod of Torah is amtakas hagvuras al yedei chsadim. So when you understand that, what I elaborated on page 13, right on 1318. Kol ha-Torah nivna al yesod zeh lahamtik hadin dekav asmel b'chesed. So once you understand that, you're not just talking about kindness and not kindness. You're talking about the transformation of the darkness or the judgments and the severities. And I elaborated at length when I explained that piece on page 1318, where he brought all the applications or a bunch of applications of Chesed and Gevurah as Torah, mitzvahs, and so on. So when you know that, it's you're talking basically. I'm not trying to pull rank here, but as you start learning more Chassidus, you realize that the Chesed and Gevurah is a very broad concept in that
I hear
sense.
you.
So like when he says the whole Torah is built on Chesed, the whole Torah is built on Chesed Gevurah, he doesn't mean on kindness and discipline. He means on the transformation of a more harsh scenario, harsh severities, harsh judgments, darkness, pain, suffering. Gevurah is all of that. So if you want to include Gevurah in the broadest sense, it's pain, suffering, golus, concealment, shem elakim, tzimtzum, din. That's Gevurah. And Chesed is the gilui of Elikus. So especially when he said the whole Torah is built on it. So Eish das lame, he brought Lichlola Smola Biyamina.
I hear you, and Chas v'Shalom, I'm not coming to contradict it. I'm coming to try to reconcile it. And I guess maybe I'm pushing it too far.
It's not a reconcile. You need to have a broader. Chesed Gevurah means a lot more than you initially thought it.
I understand. I'm not a word that you said is lost on me. I'm still trying to get back to the more simplest explanation of it.
But you're not going to get a simple, because he's not talking on the simple level. He's not talking Chesed Gevurah as Ava V'Yira here. There's places of Chassidus that talks about, you're trying to bring together places. You have to remember, you're dealing with spiritual levels. There are spheres that are talked about. Chochmah and Bina could be talked about as intellectual, cognitive faculties, but they could also be talked about as father and mother. And they could also be talked about as Oyer and Yesh, and Oyer and Keli. So you have to remember, Chassidus is you're not going to be able to fit it all into a particular, it doesn't work. Chassidus does not work that way. The terms in Chassidus are always mercurial.
Relative. Yeah. Relative to the context. Yeah.
Yeah. So ultimately, you need to understand them conceptually. Chesed fundamentally is revelation and flow. And Tzimtzum fundamentally is concealment and restraint. Then it evolves in different places to different, it's also fire and water. But here we're not talking about how it's fire and water.
I hear you.
It evolves in many, remember the 10 spheres are the DNA of all existence. And yet there are only 10. And existence consists of billions, trillions, because it's 10 building blocks that when you go back to the archetypes, there's certain principles, there's certain energies, so to speak. And then as they evolve, they manifest in all kinds of different ways.
Excellent. Yeah. It's not that I didn't understand those other, I don't know, context or usages or meanings of the terms. I was trying to, like you say, like I said, reconcile them. You're saying it's not, you can't always do that. Nevertheless, one could say that God acts with chesed, kindness, in giving us these practical mitzvahs to lighten, to illuminate the darkness. I don't know that that's such a terrible thing to say. No?
To say what? That he does say that.
God, right. So that he is, so the mitzvahs are, the tangible mitzvahs are kindness. God's giving us tangible things we can do.
No, but no, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that.
Okay. All right.
Because the Rebbe Rashab wanted to say that, he would say that. That is limiting what he's saying here. You have to broaden your understanding of Chesed and Gevurah first. You're trying to fit this into a narrower application of Chesed and Gevurah that he's referring to here.
Okay, no, I'm not trying. I'm asking if it's possible. I understood every word you said.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't know. I would avoid it. It's going to get too complicated. So which part is the Gevurah part? The Cheshach? What? Elam Hazah is the Gevurah. No, I wouldn't say that. Gevurah in Midas would be God's Gevurah. God is a Gadol HaGibur, not necessarily the darkness of this world. As soon as you say the darkness of the world, you're not talking about Gevurah in the limited sense you're talking about.
But you just said Gevurah is concealment. So what's the difference?
That is, and not trying to fit it to what you're trying to fit it into the Midas HaAdam of kindness and discipline. And that's not what he's doing here. It's exactly what I said, because that's the true meaning of the broad meaning of Chesed and Gevurah. There's nothing to reconcile, is my point, because there's no contradictions. I'm just saying you have to broaden your definition of Chesed and Gevurah based on how he's explaining it.
I got it. It's fine. It was a good review of fundamental principles, which I understand all of them. I'm not trying to overthink it, and I'm not trying to underthink it, but thank you.
Okay, so we'll stop here at the bottom of page 1323.